Thank you so much, Carice. I'm so excited to be here today and to share a little bit about my career journey and to answer any questions. Um, I'll start from the beginning. When I was younger, I really didn't know what I wanted to do growing up. I thought I'd either want to be a teacher or go into real estate. I did know I wanted to help people, but those were the only two fields where I knew adults who were happy. So I ended up going to University of Florida and majoring in business and didn't like any of the classes. And so I quickly switched my major to advertising because I was always creative and I enjoyed being creative. And I had lots of mentors in high school who always affirmed my creativity. And so I figured advertising would be a way that I can still work in the business world and use my creativity. During college is when I actually started volunteering with various nonprofit organizations. And so I went to University of Florida in Gainesville, and I volunteered with several organizations, and the one common denominator were students were involved. And so they were either mentoring programs, tutoring programs, youth development programs, but all nonprofits. And so after I graduated, I actually got a job at one of the nonprofits that I was volunteering at, working in youth development. If you know anybody who works in the nonprofit field, they will tell you they don't do it for the money. They do it for the intrinsic reward because it feels good to help people and you're doing public service. And so that was true. I was not making a lot of money as a recent graduate, so much so I got a second job at a nonprofit. That nonprofit is called Partnership for Strong Families. And basically they work with kids in foster care. And so I worked with them seasonally, making sure that all the kids in foster care had presents for every holiday. And so I did that. And then I realized I actually want to be in the classroom. I loved working with students so much. I figured I'd get some work-life balance because also in the nonprofit world, you work a lot of hours. And so I thought maybe if I become a teacher, you know, the school day ends, I get to go home. So that's what I did. I became a teacher for 2 years. I taught in Gainesville. I loved it. And I even volunteered on the school campus. The school campus had a mentoring program, and I wanted to make sure that every student, you know, had access to learn about college and career. And so I oversaw the mentoring program on top of teaching. From there, I started to realize there's a trend going on in everything that I'm doing with service. And at the time, this was in 2013, a lot of graduates were getting master's degrees in order to increase their income and to increase their job security. And so I started looking at graduate programs, and I had a friend who was attending UCF in the public administration master's program, and they had a sister degree program. They still have it today, and I highly recommend it, a master's in nonprofit management. And so that program is 100% online, but I decided to move closer to Orlando just in case I needed to go to campus for anything. And that was the time where I moved to Leesburg and worked at Lake-Sumter State College. And I ran a brand new STEM program. This STEM program actually helped me a lot in my nonprofit career because it was grant funded. And if you know anything about nonprofit organizations, they stay afloat by getting grants. And so working at the college, I got direct experience on writing grants, managing grants, doing grant reporting, having a grantor that you reported to who, you know, wanted to see that you were making an impact with the money that they were giving you. And so I did that for several years at Lake-Sumter. Ended up moving to South Florida, worked at another college and did the same program, the same grant program. And then decided I wanted to work remotely. And so I ended up getting a job at Teach for America, which is the largest nonprofit I've worked at. They have 53 offices across the country. They also have a sister organization called Teach for All that basically recruits teachers internationally. And so I was on staff at Teach for America for 3 years. And that experience was also extremely valuable because they have thousands of employees and they're basically running a large organization while running multiple smaller regional offices. And so I did that for a while. And then earlier this year, I made the switch to the smallest nonprofit I've ever worked at. I was the 5th employee. We now have 7 full-time team members. But this organization has also been an awesome experience because we are so small. I really get a lot of decision-making power and get to be even closer and even more proximate to decision-making that impacts the organization and the students that we work with. So overall, I've spent, 12 or 13 years in the nonprofit sector. Most of it has been education related, but there's a variety of nonprofits outside of education. You can work with if homeless population is important to you, if voting rights is important to you, if pets, animal healthcare is important to you, there's probably a nonprofit organization that fits your interest. So I will pause there and see if anybody has any initial questions.
How would you say your advertising degree, even though it was not direct and nonprofit, the skills that you gained from that experience helped with what you do as far as your career?
Yeah, I will say a lot of my undergraduate degree in advertising focused on like effective and efficient communication and visual arts. And so never thought I would learn Photoshop and how to do graphic design, but in multiple jobs, I've had to create flyers or social media posts or advertising to visually communicate the organization's mission. And then just being able to effectively communicate your ideas and being able to recruit either volunteers or staff members or interns in all the roles, I definitely got that foundation from my advertising degree. Any other questions?
Do most nonprofits have an IT department, at least the ones you've worked for, and what do they usually do? What is their role? And then what are some skills that you think an IT person would need for nonprofit work? Great question.
I love that question, Crystal. I was actually thinking about this because I have a friend who's done accounting her whole life, and she's always worked at nonprofits. And so something I want to highlight in your question and just for everyone is that you can do the field that you want to specialize in and still work at a nonprofit. So yes, most of the nonprofits I've worked at have an IT department. I'll say at the larger organizations, they're responsible for, the hardware and software and making sure that the companies stay connected and have what they need to be able to do their job. I would say some of the skills, and this is probably for every department in a nonprofit, is to just be agile. Like nonprofits are usually strapped for resources. And so sometimes a lot of people wear multiple hats. So even if you are in the IT department, you might also need to be the person who does the company social media because you're good with technology or you're good with computers. And so I would say just making sure that your experience is broad enough, but that you also get to do what you're passionate about doing.
What would you say is the biggest difference between working with nonprofit, besides what you mentioned with the resources and wearing multiple hats, than you would say at an organization that's not necessarily nonprofit, especially because you've worked in education with students? Mm-hmm. Like Ann and I, we work in education with students, but we wouldn't say we're nonprofit because we're definitely not under a grant or anything of that nature. So what would you say is the biggest difference?
Yeah, I would say the biggest difference is you have two bottom lines. So even the name nonprofit is like misleading because a lot of people think, oh, we can't make a profit, or nonprofits, they always have to stay balanced and, they can't, go in the green. And that's not true. Nonprofits actually need to make money and they need to make a profit and they need to stay afloat. So I would say the double bottom line of you have to be mission focused. So the reason nonprofits exist is because they have a central mission that they're trying to achieve. A lot of that is supposed to benefit society as a whole. And so you're always being held accountable for that mission. But then you also have to think like a business and you have to make money. I would say smaller nonprofits, not the one that I work at now, but the ones that I have volunteered with, they rely heavily on volunteers. And so other businesses or like a college or school, they would not be sustainable if they didn't have people on payroll. You know, you can't depend on voluntary effort to be able to carry out the tasks from day to day, but a lot of nonprofits do. And so I would say, in addition to resources, just being mindful that you have to always prioritize your mission above everything, but you also have to balance that with you need money to keep the doors open. I think I'll also add to that, nonprofits get to be selective on who they serve. And so for-profit companies, for the most part, they are basically available to the general public, whoever can afford their fee or their cost. Government organizations basically have to serve anybody who is eligible for their program. Nonprofits have a little bit more selection preference where they can choose to serve a certain population and only that population. So when I was actually in my master's program, I would say is different. Slightly off topic, but do you have any IT friends that I could connect with to learn more about their specific experience? Oh, yes, Crystal, I can definitely give that some thought and I can share that contact information with Carice and Anne, and hopefully they can pass that on to you.
Sure.
Awesome. Any other
I'm
questions?
so glad that it kept going because mine crashed over on my end. I don't know why I'm so full of questions, but so during your master's program, when you actually studied nonprofit management, what did that sort of entail? What were some of the basic foundation of the courses and what it was, I guess, teaching you or helping you to be able to do?
Yeah, so the program is phenomenal. I really just want to encourage anybody who's interested in going into the nonprofit world to check out that program at UCF. One of the classes covered board governance, which is basically the foundation to a nonprofit organization. So if you want to start a nonprofit in Florida, you have to establish a board of directors, a governing board. A lot of organizations call them different things, but basically this is your accountability structure for who oversees the executive director and staff. And so that class really helped me understand, like, if I were to create my own organization, these are the bylaws and the statutes and the rules that Florida mandates and that I need to create for my organization. Another class was strategic planning, which for nonprofits is extremely important, making sure that you have a 3 to 5 year plan, because a lot of nonprofits use their strategic plan to apply for grants. I also took a grant class. So we had to write a federal grant and a private foundation grant and actually submit it and see if you were awarded those funds for the organization that you were working with. I took a volunteer management class because volunteer management is very different than human resources, because the people who are doing your work are not on payroll. They're not employed. I'm trying to think what were some of the other courses. I want to say those are probably the ones that stuck out the most, because I still have all of the materials from that coursework, because it was so applicable that I could literally pick this up and use it for any organization that I'm either starting or working at. Do you think you would ever want to start your own nonprofit or co-start one with someone else? That is such a great question, Crystal. I would say it changes on a daily basis. I would say for the most part, yes, I would love to start my own organization. I'm actually in a doctoral program at University of Illinois in educational policy and organizational leadership. And I added that degree on top of my nonprofit experience because I am so passionate about education and making sure that students have equitable education. But I wouldn't want to start an organization that already exists. And so I'm working in the field, I'm studying the field to see like, what are the gaps? Like, what are organizations missing? Because that's something that you don't want to do, is you don't want to start a nonprofit that is identical to another organization, because then you're going to have competition for the people that you serve and the funding. And so I would say yes. Most days I desire to start my own nonprofit. I would love to co-start one. But even in going in business with somebody, you have to be very careful who that partner is and just making sure that it is somebody that you trust and that has the experience that complements your own. But yeah, great question.
Well, I do know that in the Bachelor's of Applied Science and Strategic Leadership, there is a non-profit course. I don't remember. I think it's under management. So that is something that is a possibility for students who want to at least get a little bit of that. What other ways should students sort of prepare if that's something that they are wanting to do? Like, are there other experiences or things they should do to kind of prepare or, you know, even before they get to the master's or doctoral level?
Yeah, I would say the number one thing I would recommend would be to start volunteering. And so if there's something that you're passionate about or something that is personally meaningful to you, find an organization that you can volunteer with. The pandemic has allowed a lot of organizations to move their work remotely. So even if it's not in your local vicinity, there's probably an organization that's doing something similar to what you want to do or what you're passionate about. And I would just ask to volunteer, even if it's 5 or 10 hours, to understand how they earn money, how they, keep volunteer retention high, how they actually meet their mission, what they're accountable for, what their impact has been, what are their weaknesses or challenges, ways that they feel like if they had more money or more resources that they could overcome, and learn that way. There's also a certification, I can put this in the chat, that was offered to graduate students in UCF's program. And so it's called the Certified Nonprofit. It's a national certification that you can get. You do have to do some service to get it, and you have to attend their annual conference once, but that connects you to a network of certified nonprofit professionals that we get newsletters, we get invited to webinars. And so it really helps you stay in touch with like what other nonprofits are doing that is working really well and what are challenges in the sector. And I would say during the pandemic, it was great reading what other organizations were doing and how they were transitioning to virtual. If you imagine like a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter or an abuse shelter, organizations that depend on being in person, how they had to pivot and how they had to adjust when the pandemic started. And so making sure that you're connected to a large body that has lots of resources, that one I think is a really great one. What are some of the pitfalls that people encounter when trying to work for nonprofits? You mentioned that the pay isn't always great, but what else takes people by surprise? Do a lot of people quit due to problems specific to the nonprofit work situation? I would say the first thing that comes to mind when I read that question is If you do not diversify your revenue stream, you can put yourself in a situation where you are basically at the command of whoever is paying your bills. And so a lot of organizations, let's say grants is their main revenue stream, and they depend on grant funding to operate. Their grantor has a list of requirements that they have to abide by to continue to get those funds. If they don't have any other sources of revenue, it makes it very hard for them to be innovative and creative, because somebody is basically dictating, if you want money from my organization, you need to stick by these, rules or requirements. And so I would say organizations who don't diversify their revenue stream, that is a big pitfall. I would say organizations who don't value their volunteers, if you aren't able to pay a salary for employees and you depend on volunteers, volunteer retention is so important. So making sure that your volunteers are managed appropriately in the sense that, they're scheduled and they feel appreciated, they're doing meaningful work. They feel like they are part of the organization. They have a say in how the organization runs, and making sure that you really show that you literally could not do your work without the volunteers. Yeah, I think those are the two that probably come to mind immediately. Well, I guess I can say one more, and I kind of hinted at this earlier, because this definitely took me by surprise when I started working at nonprofits, is just wearing multiple hats. And I'll even say when I worked at Teach for America, which is a very large organization with thousands of employees, I still wore multiple hats. And so even if you were interested in working in a specific field at a nonprofit, let's say IT, let's say their marketing department, let's say their event planning department, I would just be expected to be asked to contribute in other areas of the organization. Whereas in a for-profit company or in a government-run company, that might not be the case. Like, you stay in your lane and your job is your job. But very often, I would say in the nonprofit world, people wear multiple hats. Yep, Crystal, you might end up doing a little bit more than your job description. And I think that goes back to why people go into the nonprofit sector. And it really is that intrinsic reward and that intrinsic motivation. So it's that feel good, like I am making a difference in my community. I'm making a difference in somebody's life. I've met very few people that stay in the nonprofit world, and that isn't their motivation. They don't do it for the money, or they don't do it for the accolades. Most people who stay in the sector are doing it because they genuinely want to make a difference and want to help people. And so, yeah, sometimes you might have to do a little bit more.
Can you just go back to the point, and I think Crystal asked a little bit of it, but the whole being able to live while intrinsic value is important, at the same time, obviously people have to be able to pay their own bills, not just making sure the organization stays afloat. So is that possible to make a decent, obviously you're not going to be making the same as like a plastic surgeon, but but is it possible to work a nonprofit and still be able to have a family and pay your bills, or is that a misconception that pretty much you won't be able to stay in it, or may have to take 2 or 3 jobs just to make up for not getting paid as much? I guess, could you just address that?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. It's possible to have work-life balance. It's possible to make a great living wage. There's a lot of variables with that. So the size of your organization definitely comes into play, the number of employees, their different revenue streams, and then your specific boundaries. And so when I was young, fresh out of college, and worked at my first nonprofit, I definitely worked 70, 80-hour weeks, only because that was like what I thought people did when they started their careers. They just worked all the time. And the older I got, the more I started talking to people who weren't in the nonprofit world. I was like, oh, the 40-hour or 50-hour work week is a real thing, and you should be able to get your work done in that time frame. And then obviously when I went to graduate school, and now that I'm in graduate school now, I also, have a partner. And so like, I do have very strong boundaries as far as like, I will only work a certain amount of hours per day or per week. I will say the nonprofit sector also allows a lot of flexibility, at least the organizations that I've worked at. So it's not your traditional 9 to 5. And so even though I may only work 45 or 50 hours a week, it's not going to be, it may not always be during, a typical work day. And then as far as a living wage, absolutely. There are obviously larger organizations who can pay. I know people who work in the nonprofit sector who do make 6 figures and they, live very comfortably. And I will say, like, from the time that I started after I graduated till now, my salary has increased. I think a lot of that comes with experience. I would always be adding, educational credentials. So if it's not an actual degree, finding different professional development courses or licensing or certifications that you can add to your experience and knowledge that do make you marketable. And so, yes, maybe you might have to make a switch to a different organization that's willing to compensate you more, but it's absolutely possible to work in the nonprofit sector and live comfortably.
I just asked the other students if they have any other final questions, as it's 6 o'clock and we're wrapping up. Oh, there is one.
How do you set those hours per week boundaries? What should I consider when deciding what those boundaries will be? How would you enforce them? Yeah, so I think this is definitely everyone's personal preference. Some of it will be dictated by your supervisor. So, if your supervisor needs you in the office certain hours, then yes, that would be your schedule. I would also say some of it depends on your comfort level and how much you enjoy working and what you need to step away from work. So your mental well-being and when you need to shut things off as far as your laptop or your computer and not think about work. And I think some of that comes with trial and error. So when you do start working a full-time job and you do hit that 50 hours one week, how does it make you feel at the end of the week? Are you energized or are you drained? How do you feel coming back to work on Monday? Are you looking forward to it or you're dreading it? And so I think some of that comes with practice and with, trial and error. I will say that you definitely just want to be mindful that if your work is demanding, that you are taking breaks at some point. And so even when I was working, 70 or 80-hour weeks, I would take like a week or 2 weeks off and I wouldn't check email, I wouldn't work, I wouldn't take calls. And so just really disconnecting. I would also say if you have other commitments outside of work or outside of school, that you are honoring those. So I shared I'm a graduate student. I can't work crazy hours. I have, papers to write and research to do. And so I'm very, very mindful. I use my calendar and people know like Sara is unavailable after this time. So I think a lot of it comes with how you decide to organize, your work week when you start or as you start pursuing your career, like figuring out what is too much and making sure that you set those boundaries for yourself and that you communicate that to your team as well.
I just want to add that that's a skill, no matter if you're a nonprofit or not.
Agreed, yeah.
I definitely put in way many hours trying to do certain tasks that I knew it was expected of me, not that they required me to work outside of the scope of hours, but you knew it had to be done by a certain time. But you do over time learn how to communicate that with your supervisor. And at the end of the day, as long as you're accomplishing what you need to get done, or there is a more efficient way, so it doesn't take you as long and requiring 80 hours to get it done, that you're sharing that and requesting that in order to be able to have a work-life balance. So that is definitely a skill. The last thing I would ask before we wrap up, because it is our time, is how, and maybe because this is a shameless plug for our networking event, how important is it to professional development as well as things like networking or utilizing folks that you know to help you accomplish some of those goals. Not necessarily so much to get them to be a volunteer at your organization, but just in general, just sort of how important is that in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, I will share, I think my last 2 jobs, and then one of the jobs I had when I lived in Gainesville, I got those jobs due to networking. And so I'm a big proponent of meeting people who are outside of your realm of expertise. And so having friends or contacts who are maybe not interested in the same things that you are, so that if there is an opportunity that opens up, that you have somebody in that sector, in that field, that could maybe be a reference for you. I also know networking has helped me because I've been pretty open when I'm ready to do a move or when I'm ready to have a change of career, of sharing that with people in my network. And so the job I have now, I actually had a colleague at my last organization who saw the job description and said, Sarah, this matches you to a T. And I know you're looking for a change, you should apply. And if that person didn't send me the job description, I don't know that I would have seen the job posting. And that's happened to me multiple times. And so I would say it's extremely important to have people that you trust and sharing, what your interests are and where you're hoping to go. I want to commend Crystal for even asking me, like, hey, do you know anybody in the IT world and nonprofit? Like, that is a form of networking. So anytime you meet somebody, definitely bridge that connection, share contact information, and then keep them in mind or reach out if they come to mind or if there's a question that you want to get their advice or wisdom on.